Welcome everyone to Unit 2, Lesson 1. Today, we're going to be talking about a conflict called the French and Indian War and how this is going to lead to round 1 of tensions between America and Great Britain that will lead to the American Revolution. For your essential idea, we're going to be talking about how that conflict, the French and Indian War, is going to cause England to switch its policies towards the American colonies. For your essential question, you're going to be determining what the purpose of those actions would be. So let's focus on the conflict. What was the French and Indian War? The reason that the war started was pretty much the same as most conflicts at that time. Both England and France wanted to dominate Europe, and to do so, they wanted to have as much land in the American colonies as they could. Now, if you remember, America was controlled by Britain, the 13 colonies, but most of Canada had already been taken over by France. While they didn't put a lot of troops there, they did still use that land to help build up their power through their colonies. But in particular, both Britain and France wanted to control one particular area, known as the Ohio River Valley, where they would both seek to build forts and to use that land to grow crops needed for success. In the lead up to the war, you would see what's known as the Albany Congress meet in New York, where 7 colonies would send representatives to attempt to propose a way to unite the colonies together into a government. Benjamin Franklin would lead this charge, creating what's known as the Albany Plan of Union. And this would be the base of what you'll see in the constitutional conventions. Overall, the Albany Plan would fail and would be rejected by the colonies that attended. But this would be the first attempt that we would see at uniting the colonies together. You see that image that's on the screen? You will see this image again, but this comes from the Albany Plan of Union, a concept that if the colonies did not combine together, the entire venture of the colonies would fail. Fighting in the French and Indian War was pretty one-sided. For the most part, you would have the English and the colonies fighting together against the French and their Indian allies. George Washington would become a hero to the American colonies for his courage during the war, although he would not necessarily have the best record in combat. England was going to be able to win largely because they used their powerful navy to blockade all supplies from getting into New France, meaning that they could not sustain the war. Spain would eventually join with the English side to fight against France, and this would cause the war to end in 1763. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Paris of 1763 would be signed. It is very important that you know that this treaty, the 1763 treaty, is going to be for the French and Indian War. There will be one more Treaty of Paris in this unit alone in 1783, but that will be for the American Revolution. This treaty, however, 1763, ends the 7-year or the French and Indian War. It will give all of the land to the east of the Mississippi River to the English, and would give all of the land of New France to the west of the Mississippi River to Spain. This would include the port city of New Orleans. Looking at the map, you can see exactly how this would play out. The Mississippi River is now going to be the main barricade between the English American colonies and the Spanish side of the Americas. The only part that we do need to pay attention to is down in Florida. That shows that it's controlled by Britain. That is not yet the case. There are going to be certain conflicts that will take place after the colonists go across the Appalachian Mountains into those previously French-held territories. One of these conflicts is going to take place near the current city of Detroit against the Indian chief, Chief Pontiac. They will attack a British fort, and this will cause a massive conflict to take place. And although the British troops will end up defeating the Native Americans, they're going to seek to prevent future conflicts in that western part of the English territories. The French and Indian War and Pontiac's rebellion is going to cause an end to something called salutary neglect, a concept in which England would leave the colonies alone and let them do whatever they pretty much wanted. The French and Indian War would put massive debt onto the English government, and the concept of having to provide protection for American settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains would also cause England to step in. What this means is that England is going to tighten its grip because of this war. This is going to cause them to start approaching the Americas in a different way. They don't want to pay for the protection of those Western territories. They don't want to have the debt for that conflict solely on England. And to do this, you're going to see England start to propose new policies and new taxes onto the colonies that will take away some of their independence and lead many colonists to seek their own independence from England. An act known as the Proclamation of 1763 is going to be the effective beginning of round one of tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain. This proclamation by King George would say that no English settlers can settle across the Appalachian Mountains. This is going to make the colonists very angry, particularly because the only reason we fought the French and Indian War was for that Ohio River Valley, all of which was west of the Appalachian Mountains. Many people would choose to ignore this law and would settle out there anyways. Another act that would impact the people in the American colonies would be the Sugar Act, which is going to be a law that would tax sugar and molasses, both from the same product, and this would hurt the merchants of the American colonies more than anyone else. These merchants, trying to avoid that law, would attempt to smuggle their goods, but when they were caught, they were deemed to be guilty until they were proven innocent, which would go against the concepts of English court back home. The colonists would react in several ways to this, but many of them would be upset that this was a tax that would be levied against the American colonies, even though we had no representation in the British Parliament. This will lead to the concept of no taxation without representation, becoming a popular phrase in the American colonies. Another act that was passed that may seem small today but was of huge importance back then was the Quartering Act, which means that colonists would be required to provide food and shelter to any British soldier that requests to stay at your home. This means that the British can walk up to your door one night, knock at the door, and tell you that they will be staying the night and tell you to go get them food. This is going to be so important to the American colonists that this whole concept will become its own amendment in the future Constitution. Perhaps of all of the acts that would take place that would cause tension, the Stamp Act would be the most important and most damaging to relations. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first ever direct tax on the colonists. This would go after everyone, not just merchants. Pretty much any material that was on paper was going to be taxed, whether it was a newspaper, playing cards, deeds, posters, any kind of legal document would be taxed by the British government. This means that anybody who received any paper would end up being taxed. This brings back the whole concept of no taxation without representation, but puts it onto a much larger scale. You'd have vigilante groups, such as the Sons of Liberty, who would organize demonstrations and would even lead to attacks on these tax collectors. You'd also have delegates from the colonies that would be sent to what's called the Stamp Act Congress, which would ask the King of England to take actions in repealing that law. We would also get the non-importation agreements, in which colonists would agree to boycott any British products that would have this stamp tax put on them. This was an attempt to hurt British business and to hope that this would sway the government. As you can see in this image, you can see what one of the demonstrations would be: burning somebody in effigy. This would be directed towards a tax collector. But we'd also see it in different ways with different punishments, such as this one. For those of you who do not know what this is tarring and feathering, in which a man would be covered in hot tar and would be covered then in feathers. This would be very difficult to take off and was a brutal, painful, and humiliating way of treating tax collectors. This would cause tension back in Britain when they saw this happening to people that were working for the government. But in all, we would end up having this one act be repealed. The Stamp Act would go away because of tension, boycotts, and protests, but English would put in its place what's known as the Declaratory Acts, which would say that England's authority in the colonies was total and that they have the ability to make laws. They will use this declaratory act leading into the next two rounds in the eventual American Revolution. Thank you guys. This is the end of this lesson. I will see you in the next one.